Somewhere out there, right now, a woman is convinced that building wealth is basically a men's club with a very old membership list, and women just recently got handed a guest pass. She did not decide this on purpose. Nobody sat her down and said it directly. It just seeped in from movies, from history class, from every finance show that pictures a man in a suit shouting numbers while women stand somewhere in the background holding a purse instead of a portfolio. She is not stupid for believing this. She is just working with incomplete information. And today we're going to fix that thoroughly and with a little bit of attitude because honestly, this myth has had a long enough run. Let's talk about where money actually lived before it lived in banks. Long before direct deposits, before interest rates, before anyone had ever heard the phrase compound growth, wealth had a much simpler home. It sat on a woman's fingers. It hung from her ears. It wrapped around her wrists like a bracelet, except it was never just a bracelet. It was liquid currency you could wear to a wedding. In the ancient world, gold and silver were not simply pretty accessories handed out to make a woman look nice at dinner. They were units of value, weighed, measured, and traded. And here is the detail that keeps getting skipped in the version of history most people were taught. That jewelry usually belonged to her, not her husband, not her father, her. It was given at marriage, but ownership stayed in her hands. If a household collapsed, if a husband died, if life fell apart the way life sometimes does, she could melt it down, sell it, or trade it, and rebuild an entire financial future from what she was wearing that morning. That is not decoration. That is an emergency fund with excellent taste. Picture the scene for a second. A woman standing in a bustling ancient marketplace, examining the weight of a gold bracelet the way a broker studies a stock ticker today, calculating exactly what it is worth and exactly what it could become. She was not confused about value. She understood leverage before leverage had a name. And jewelry was only the beginning. In several ancient civilizations, women legally owned land, ran independent businesses, and controlled inheritance in ways that would honestly surprise people who assume history was one long stretch of women standing quietly behind a man doing the real work. There were female landowners negotiating boundaries, female merchants moving goods across regions, female moneylenders extending credit and expecting repayment plus interest because apparently patience has never been free. Some women even financed trade expeditions, putting resources into a voyage and expecting a return when the ships came back, which, if you think about it, is essentially the ancient version of buying into a risky startup and hoping it does not sink. Sometimes, literally. There is one more detail worth sitting with before we move forward, because it explains why this pattern kept surviving even when entire empires did not. Wealth stored in something wearable was portable in a way land never could be. If a woman had to leave a household, flee a bad situation, or start over somewhere new, she could carry her entire financial position on her body without anyone noticing she was carrying anything of consequence at all. That is not just clever. That is a survival strategy disguised as an accessory, and it worked precisely because nobody suspected a piece of jewelry could function as an escape plan and a bank account at the same time. She was not waiting for permission to build wealth. She was doing the math. But here is where the story gets a little more complicated and a little more human. Even with all of this financial power, ancient women still had to move differently than men did. A man could simply build wealth and call it ambition. A woman had to build it, protect it, and often disguise it, all at the same time. Wealth had to look like tradition instead of ambition because ambition in a woman tends to make people nervous, and apparently it has for a very long time. That psychological weight rarely makes it into the story. It was never only about acquiring resources. It was about acquiring resources quietly enough that nobody started asking uncomfortable questions about why she had them. And it was not only the wealthy who understood this game. Even in modest households, women managed household economies with a level of precision that rivaled any modern budget spreadsheet, except there was no spreadsheet. There was memory, negotiation, and an almost frightening ability to stretch limited resources across an entire year without anyone starving or going without shoes. That skill gets dismissed as domestic responsibility. It was actually financial management, just without the title, the office, or the applause. Think about what it takes to run a household economy with no formal banking system, no safety net, and no guarantee that a bad harvest or a bad year would not wipe everything out. That requires forecasting. That requires risk assessment. That requires the exact same skill set modern financial advisors get paid enormous amounts of money to teach in seminars today. Except back then it was simply called being a wife, and nobody wrote her a check for doing it well. Keep that pattern in mind because it does not disappear. It just changes outfits. Let's move into the medieval era, where the disguise shifts shape, but the underlying strategy stays surprisingly familiar. This period tends to get pictured as the most restrictive stretch for women in history, and in a lot of ways, that reputation is earned. Yet inside those restrictions, something interesting kept happening. Widows in medieval towns frequently inherited full control of their late husband's businesses, and a lot of them did not just maintain those businesses out of obligation, they expanded them. Textile production, brewing, trade guilds, several of these industries had significant female involvement, and in some towns, entire guild chapters were run almost exclusively by women. Sit with that for a moment. A woman losing a husband in this era was not only grieving, she was often thrown directly into running a business overnight, expected to keep looms working, debts paid, and workers employed, with zero formal training in finance and zero applause waiting for her if she pulled it off. Succeed, and nobody throws a parade. Struggle even slightly, and suddenly everyone remembers. That imbalance is the real hidden truth of this era. Financial competence was rarely framed as ambition. It was framed as duty, survival, obligation, anything except what it actually was, which was skill. And somehow, buried inside that pressure, women still managed to grow estates, negotiate trade deals, and pass down larger inheritances than the ones they were originally given. There is also a detail that rarely gets mentioned, which is the sheer amount of record-keeping this required. Running a guild business or a trade estate meant tracking debts owed, debts due, inventory, wages, and contracts, all without the convenience of a calculator or a filing cabinet. Many of these women kept meticulous mental and written ledgers, negotiated with suppliers who assumed they could be talked down simply because a man was not present at the table, and still came out ahead often enough that entire trade networks depended on their reliability. Reliability, by the way, is not a soft skill. It is the entire foundation of credit, and credit is the entire foundation of wealth. Here is where most versions of this story get it wrong. People treat medieval women who handled serious money as rare exceptions, unusual footnotes tucked into the margins of real history. They were not exceptions. They were a consistent pattern that got edited out of the main narrative because it was inconvenient to admit that women were financially sharp during a period that insisted they should not be. If this is the kind of thing that fascinates you, the overlooked financial history that never made it into any textbook you were handed in school, this channel exists exactly for that. So go ahead and subscribe because there is a lot more of this pattern still to uncover. Now here is the part that really lands emotionally, because the psychological setup behind medieval wealth management is almost identical to something still happening today. Confidence had to stay quiet. Competence had to stay modest. A woman could be excellent at managing an entire estate, but she was rarely allowed to be seen enjoying that success, celebrating it, or claiming credit for it out loud. The wealth had to serve the family name. It could never be framed as belonging to her personally. Let that sit for a second. The skill was real. The recognition was never allowed to match it. That specific dynamic, real skill paired with invisible credit, is one of the oldest financial patterns that exists, and it did not vanish the moment horse carriages turned into cars and candles turned into light bulbs. There is a legal detail buried in this era that deserves more attention than it usually gets. In several regions during this period, a woman's personal property, the assets she brought into a marriage or earned through her own trade, could be legally protected as separate from her husband's estate. This meant that even in a system stacked against her in almost every other way, there existed a narrow but real legal channel through which she could retain something that was undeniably hers. Lawyers today would call this asset protection. Back then, it barely had a name, but the function was identical, shielding value from circumstances outside her control. This detail matters because it proves something important. The instinct to protect and grow personal wealth was not something women discovered recently through a finance podcast. It was embedded into legal systems centuries ago, quietly, because enough women demanded a mechanism to keep what they had built from disappearing the moment a marriage or a household shifted. Which brings us to the modern era, where this story stops being a history lesson and starts feeling uncomfortably familiar. Today, women are constantly told that they are new to money, new to investing, new to building wealth from scratch. As if centuries of jewelry functioning as currency and centuries of widows running entire trade operations simply never happened. Modern financial media loves to frame women's wealth as a fresh trend, something with a launch date, something with a catchy hashtag attached to it. None of that is accurate. What changed was never whether women could build wealth. What changed is who is finally allowed to talk about it out loud without somebody clutching their pearls. A woman today opening an investment account on her phone is doing essentially the same thing a woman centuries ago did when she calculated the resale value of the gold on her wrist. She is converting what she has into leverage. She is turning current resources into future options. The tools evolved. The instinct did not need an update. There is another layer to the modern chapter of this story worth sitting with, and it has nothing to do with apps or account balances. It has to do with information itself. For most of history, financial literacy was something passed down quietly inside families, inside guilds, inside communities that already had access to it. If nobody around you was allowed to speak openly about money, you did not simply lack money, you lacked the entire vocabulary needed to build it. That gap is not ancient history. Plenty of women today are still catching up not because they lack intelligence, but because the language of investing, assets, and compounding was never handed to them the way it was casually handed to someone raised around it. That is not a flaw in her. That is simply an information gap finally closing, later than it should have, but closing nonetheless. And once the language is available, the instinct that was always there, the one running quietly through every era we just walked through, does not need to be taught from scratch. It only needs to be reactivated. Here comes the part that stings a little, so brace yourself. Even now, surrounded by apps, index funds, and an endless stream of financial content telling women to invest early and invest often, a lot of women still approach money with the exact same quiet hesitation their ancestors were forced into. Not because they lack ability, because the psychological residue of centuries spent disguising ambition as duty does not simply disappear because one algorithm decided to recommend a podcast episode about compound interest. That hesitation is not weakness. It is inherited caution wearing a modern outfit. And here's the real twist buried underneath this entire story. The biggest obstacle standing between women and wealth was never a lack of history. It was a lack of permission to claim the history that already existed. Nobody handed women a starting point in this conversation because nobody wanted to admit there already was one. Once a woman actually understands that she comes from an unbroken line of financial participants, not a recent arrival to the conversation, something shifts internally. She stops quietly asking whether she is allowed to want wealth and starts asking, out loud, how much of it she is actually willing to build. This is the angle that rarely gets discussed. This was never a story about women catching up to men financially. It is a story about women reclaiming a seat at a table they originally built and were quietly nudged away from somewhere along the way. It is worth pausing on how strange that framing really is once you notice it. Catching up implies a late start. It implies women showed up to a race everyone else had already been running for centuries. But you cannot catch up to a race you were already running before it had an official name. The framing itself is the problem, not the women it describes. Think about what that realization does to ambition. A woman is not starting from zero. She is starting from an inheritance of instinct, strategy, and financial intelligence passed down through generations who were never publicly credited for having it in the first place. The jewelry was never just jewelry. It was liquidity with excellent styling. The guild leadership was never just survival. It was strategy dressed up as obligation, so nobody would ask too many questions. The modern investment account is not a trend piece for a headline. It is a continuation of something that has been running quietly in the background for centuries. And here is the deeper truth sitting underneath everything we just walked through. Wealth was never really about the money itself. It was always about control over one's own story. The ancient woman negotiating gold weight in a marketplace was not chasing luxury for its own sake. She was chasing the ability to make her own decisions without needing anyone's approval first. The medieval widow expanding a trade business was not chasing status. She was chasing a stability that could not easily be stripped away from her. The modern woman opening a brokerage account today is not chasing a trend. She is chasing the exact same thing every woman before her was quietly chasing: the right to define her own life on her own terms, without asking permission from anyone standing nearby. Money has always been the disguise. Autonomy was always the actual prize hiding underneath it. Every era simply changed the packaging. Gold on a wrist. A ledger behind a guild counter. A blinking number on a screen. Different centuries, different tools, identical instinct running quietly underneath all of it. The instinct to hold something that cannot be taken away without a fight. So the next time someone tries to frame women and wealth as some kind of brand new awakening, remember this conversation. The awakening already happened more than once across several centuries, and every single time, women built, protected, and expanded what they had, often while being quietly told it was not really theirs to claim in the first place. It was always theirs. It still is. The only real difference now is that a woman no longer has to disguise her ambition as tradition, duty, or survival just to be allowed to have it. She does not need a costume for it anymore. She does not need to bury it inside someone else's name, someone else's household, or someone else's permission. She can simply call it what it has always actually been: ambition, fully in the open, finally allowed to say its own name, out loud, on her own terms, in her own century.